The GIDA emergency response team arrived at Guardian headquarters 47 minutes after the alarms triggered. Cecil Stedman was in the back of a black SUV 3 blocks out when the situation report came through his earpiece. He already knew what happened. He had known for 12 minutes. He was not processing the information anymore. He was composing himself. The specific, deliberate act of a man who understood that the face he wore into that room would set the temperature of every decision that followed. The driver didn't say anything. Cecil had worked with him for 9 years. He understood silence. The SUV stopped. Cecil buttoned his jacket. He stepped out into the cold November air and walked toward the building without hurrying, because hurrying communicated panic. And panic was a disease that spread faster than any pathogen he had ever encountered in 30 years of this work. He kept his eyes level. He already knew what was inside. 8 minutes earlier, the Guardian's briefing room sat on the 14th floor of Guardian headquarters, a long, windowless space designed for classified threat assessment, with a reinforced table bolted to the floor and chairs that had been replaced twice in 6 years because the Immortal kept breaking them during arguments. The walls were gray. The lighting was fluorescent and flat. It was not a room built for comfort. It was a room built for the kind of conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else. Nolan Grayson stood at the head of the table. He had called the assembly 40 minutes ago. Emergency briefing, threat assessment, come now. That was all the message said. They came because he was Omni-Man, because in 23 years he had never called something an emergency that wasn't. Red Rush arrived first, still in his suit, his dark hair slightly damp from whatever he'd been doing when the call came through. He took his usual seat, third from the left, close to the door, old habit, and nodded at Nolan across the table. Sergei had been a speedster for 19 years. He processed the world at a frequency that most people couldn't access. He noticed things in the margins of moments that other people missed entirely. He noticed, when Nolan nodded back, that Nolan's weight was slightly forward. It was a small thing, a half-inch of postural lean that meant nothing on its own. Sergei filed it without deciding what it meant. Martian Man came through the door next, followed by War Woman, then Aquarius, then Green Ghost. She didn't use the door exactly. She came through the wall adjacent to it, which she sometimes did when she was tired and couldn't be bothered with handles. Darkwing arrived last, his cape still settling around him as he took his seat, and he made a comment under his breath about the lighting that nobody responded to. Nolan waited for the door to close. Then he moved. He did not announce it. No speech, no ultimatum. He had spent 23 years among humans and absorbed, against his will, a thorough education in their tactical errors. The primary one was that they talked. They told people what was coming. They gave their targets the gift of a half-second to respond. Nolan had no intention of making that gift. His first target was Red Rush. The speedster was the most dangerous variable if given time to act. Remove him in the first second, and the rest of the room became manageable. He moved at full acceleration, crossing the length of the table in a fraction of a breath. His hand already forming the grip that would close around Sergei's throat, Sergei dropped. Not a decision. A reflex. 19 years of his body developing pre-conscious threat response, not reading Nolan's mind, but reading the room, reading the weight shift, reading the 2-degree lean he had filed 30 seconds ago, without deciding what it meant. His body decided before he did. He dropped below the grab, planted both feet on the floor, and drove himself upward into Nolan's left side in a running strike that landed against his kidney region with everything Sergei could generate in a half-step. The pain wasn't significant. Nolan had absorbed worse from rocks dropped from orbital altitude. The surprise was, he recalibrated, pivoting, tracking Rush's exit trajectory, already adjusting his second vector. Rush was out of reach. Predictably fast, which was Rush's one exploitable constant, he moved in straight lines when reactive, arcing only when he had time to plan. Nolan's second priority was already moving. Martian Man had begun to shift, his body expanding at the shoulders. his face reforming into something broader and more dangerous. Nolan crossed the room and hit him, a closed fist strike to the skull at full acceleration. The sound it made was not a sound that belonged in a building. Martian Man's head snapped sideways. He hit the floor with the heavy, boneless weight of something no longer able to make decisions. His skull had fractured in 3 places. He was breathing. He would not be for long. 4 seconds had passed. Darkwing deployed. The room went black. Not dark, black. The distinction mattered. Dark implied gradation, implied your eyes might adjust. This was the complete absence of visual information, a field of absolute sensory deprivation Darkwing could sustain for as long as he had breath to fuel it. Nolan switched to spatial awareness. He could feel the displacement of air. He could hear breathing, 5 distinct rhythms all moving. He tracked Darkwing by the concentration of the field itself, the point of origin slightly left and above, and grabbed for it. He connected. He threw Darkwing into the wall with enough force to crack 3 ribs and collapse a lung. The darkness fragmented, and then closed again, and then fragmented once more as Darkwing's consciousness stuttered. On the 3rd fragmentation, it didn't come back. Aquarius hadn't moved far from his seat, out of water, out of his element, with nothing in the room to manipulate. Nolan hit him once, a single strike to the sternum, driving bone inward. Aquarius crumpled without a sound. 10 seconds. Red Rush had used those 10 seconds well. He had been hitting Nolan during the darkness. Dozens of strikes, not powerful individually, but hitting the same location repeatedly with the methodical precision of someone who understood he couldn't break a wall but could, given enough time, erode it. The base of Nolan's skull. The same point. Over and over. The cumulative effect was that Nolan's head was ringing in a way it had not rung in a very long time. 94% and recalibrating. War Woman did not fight the way he expected. She went low, a sweeping strike at ground level, targeting his ankles, forcing his attention downward. He reached for the weapon on instinct. She let him take it. She released it deliberately, and as he bent forward with the weight of his own grab, she drove her knee into his face with every pound of force she could channel through her hip flexor and body weight, and years of training against opponents significantly larger than her. His head snapped back, 91%. Then Green Ghost's hand was inside his chest. Not through it, around it. Her arm, semi-solidified, her fingers positioned around the exterior of his ribcage, the pressure of partial solidification creating something that had no accurate name, a sensation like his ribs were expanding outward from the inside. It wasn't damage. Viltrumite durability didn't register it as damage. But his body's autonomic response locked his musculature for 0.6 of a second. The immortal came down from the ceiling. He had been there since the 3rd second, clinging to the infrastructure above the lighting panels, waiting for the math of the fight to resolve toward this moment. He dropped with his full weight concentrated into both knees and landed on Nolan's upper back. The impact shook the building. The table bolted to the floor, moved 1/2 inch. Nolan hit the floor. He did not immediately get back up. What followed was 35 seconds that none of them would ever accurately describe, not because it was too fast to remember, but because the memory had a quality their minds couldn't resolve into clean narrative. Rush delivered sustained strikes to his face and neck, his left arm already broken at the collarbone, working entirely with his right. War Woman recovered her weapon and targeted pressure points, the small bones in Nolan's hands, his kneecap, the elbow joint. Green Ghost cycled in and out, denying him anything to grab. Immortal held on. That was all he did. Absorb the strikes Nolan delivered, each blow caving in something that reconstructed itself in real time. Taking the hits and not letting go. War Woman's shoulder was dislocated. Rush's collarbone was gone. Immortal looked like something that had been in a car compactor. Nolan's strikes were still devastating. There were fewer of them now. At 47 seconds, Rush caught the ankle he had been trying to catch for 1/2 minute. He drove Nolan's leg into the floor, and the angle brought Nolan's head down by 3 inches, and Green Ghost was already there. Her arm surrounding the exterior of his brain stem, the pressure of partial solidification applied to the medulla with a precision she had never attempted before, and would spend a long time afterward trying to understand how she'd known to attempt now. Nolan's motor signals stuttered. Warwoman's weapon connected with the base of his skull at full extension. Nolan pitched forward and did not rise. Cecil walked into the room 12 minutes after it ended. He took 12 seconds to assess it. 3 dead or dying. Darkwing confirmed. Aquarius confirmed. Martian man breathing but wrong in ways that didn't resolve into anything good. Rush pressed against the far wall, his right arm hanging at an angle that made Cecil's jaw tighten. Warwoman seated on the floor, breathing in the rhythm of someone managing pain they couldn't afford to acknowledge. Green Ghost in the corner, her hands phasing in and out in small involuntary cycles, staring at the floor. Immortal standing over Nolan's body, caved in across the chest, regenerating, unmoving, Nolan Grayson face down on the floor. Breathing, slowly, Cecil looked at all of it. Then he said 4 words. Nobody talks about this. It landed as a command. It settled into the room as something closer to a threat. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the wet, rhythmic work of Immortal's body rebuilding itself, and the slow, labored cycling of the man on the floor. Cecil reached into his jacket and took out his phone. He called 2 people. He was not ready to call Debbie Grayson yet. He needed 10 minutes first. He needed to build the exact shape of the lie before he delivered it. Because a lie that didn't fit perfectly was just a different kind of damage, and he had enough damage in this room already. The Vault protocol would begin within the hour. Nolan Grayson was carried out in a sealed medical unit before the sun came up. He would not see daylight again for a very long time. Agent Kate Langley knocked on the Grayson front door at 4:17 in the afternoon. She had done this 41 times in her career. Casualty notification was a specific discipline, not a skill exactly, because skill implied something that could be refined into ease, and it never got easier, it only got more precise. She had learned to keep her hands visible. She had learned not to wear dark colors, because dark colors signaled funeral before the words did. She had learned to make eye contact immediately and hold it. She was holding a sealed envelope with Cecil Stedman's handwriting on the front. Debbie Grayson opened the door in a blue sweater with a dish towel over her shoulder, and her face did the thing that faces do in the half-second before they understand. A brief, open expression of ordinary social expectation, and then it closed. Not into grief, not yet. Into attention. "Mrs. Grayson," Kate said. "My name is Agent Kate Langley. I'm with the Gita. May I come in?" Debbie sat at the kitchen table and listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She asked Agent Langley once to start again from the beginning. And Langley did. The emergency assembly, the unidentified attackers, the engagement, the injuries sustained, the current status, and Debbie nodded at each sentence with the careful patience of someone making sure every word was filed correctly before the next one arrived. When Langley finished the second time, Debbie looked at the envelope on the table. "Is he going to wake up?" she asked. "The medical team is optimistic," Langley said. "He's stable." "Stable," Debbie repeated. Not as a question. As a word she was testing the weight of. There was radiation involved in the attack. The medical situation requires a controlled setting. Civilian access isn't possible right now, but you'll be updated as that changes. Debbie nodded. She looked at the dish towel in her hands. She had no memory of picking it up. "Thank you for coming in person," she said. "That was considerate." Langley said the things she was trained to say. She left a contact card. She asked twice if there was someone Debbie wanted her to call, and Debbie said no both times. The front door closed. Debbie sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, a half-chopped onion on the cutting board, a pot of water that had boiled down to a quarter of its original volume before she registered the sound and got up to turn off the burner, then sat back down. She did not cry. She held the envelope and eventually opened it and read Cecil's note, the careful, precise handwriting, the specific warmth of a man who understood that warmth was a tool and wielded it without apology. Nolan is alive. He fought to protect every one of his team. He is in our care, and he is safe. She read it 3 times. She put it back in the envelope. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. The November light went gray and flat across the kitchen floor. She got up and put the onion in the refrigerator. Then she sat back down. She would tell Mark tonight. She decided. She would find the words by then. Mark's phone buzzed at 3:48 p.m., 40 feet above Lake Michigan. He had been up for 2 hours, not patrolling exactly, not yet, still in the phase where flying felt like something given to him rather than something he owned. He went up when he needed to think. The altitude simplified things. He looked at the number, Gita frequency. He answered. The voice on the other end was not Cecil's. It was an administrative coordinator, calm and professional, and Mark listened to the words and they arrived in the wrong order somehow. Incident, guardians, your father, medical, stable, and he said what twice before the coordinator slowed down and started again. Is he? Mark stopped. Restarted. What does stable mean? The coordinator said stable meant alive. Stable meant the medical team was present and the situation was being managed. Stable meant Mark should come to the facility. I'm coming, Mark said. He was there in 4 minutes. Cecil was waiting at the entrance. Not behind a desk, not framed by the institutional machinery of the Gita in a way that would create distance. He was standing at the front entrance in his coat, and when Mark came down from the sky, still moving too fast, and landed harder than he meant to on the concrete approach, Cecil was already walking toward him. Mark, he said. Not Invincible. Not son. Mark, Cecil walked him inside while he talked. The movement was deliberate. Cecil understood that people in shock needed to be in motion. And he told the story of the attack with the measured cadence of a man describing something that had cost him personally. The assembly, the unknown entities, the engagement, the outcome. Mark listened the way Debbie had listened, which neither of them knew. I want to see him, Mark said. The radiation exposure, it's produced a medical environment we can't safely open to. I want to see him. Cecil stopped walking. He turned to face Mark fully. Then he did something that only a man who had spent 30 years reading people could do effectively. He absorbed the demand without deflecting it, let it sit between them without flinching, and said, I know you do. He reached out and put his hand over Mark's, briefly, the way a person does when they mean it. Your father is 3 levels below us in the best medical facility this organization has ever built. Every resource we have is in that room with him. I need you to trust me when I tell you that the most dangerous thing for him right now is any disruption to that environment. Mark looked at him. He fought to keep them alive, Cecil said. He put himself between those attackers and every single one of his teammates. That is who your father is. Mark's jaw moved. His eyes went somewhere that wasn't the room. Okay, he said. His voice was doing something he didn't want it to do, and he shut it down by not saying anything else. Cecil gave him the space. The first training session with the Immortal happened 11 days later. He did not introduce himself when Mark arrived at the training floor. He was already there, working through a sequence against a reinforced pad, and he stopped when he heard Mark land on the roof access stairs and turned and looked at him with the specific quality of attention that had nothing to do with welcome. You're late, he said. Mark had been on time. He trained Mark for 3 hours without explaining why anything was done the way it was done. If Mark performed a technique incorrectly, Immortal demonstrated the correct version once and waited. He did not encourage. He did not critique beyond the demonstration. At the end of the 3 hours, when Mark's arms were burning in the way the Viltrumite part of his biology would recover from by morning, but hadn't yet, Immortal picked up a towel and said, Whatever killed 3 of my team in 47 seconds is still out there, and you're what we have. Mark looked at him. I'll be ready. Immortal looked back with the eyes of a man who had watched people be ready and die and be unready and die, and could no longer locate the meaningful difference. He did not say anything else. He left the training floor. Mark stood there for a minute. He thought about what Immortal had said and found it motivating in the way that fear, correctly applied, could be motivating. He did not yet have a reason to find it horrifying. Dinner was quiet in the Grayson house. Debbie had made pasta. Not a special occasion pasta, the weeknight version. The one she made when she was tired and comfort cooking rather than cooking for a reason. She set 3 places at the table out of habit, then stood looking at the 3rd setting before she left it there. Mark ate. He talked about the training, Immortal's methods, something Red Rush had explained about reading movement patterns, the new Gita clearance Cecil had mentioned. Debbie listened and asked questions and laughed once at something he said about War Woman's opinion of his footwork. Nolan's coffee mug sat at his place. She had not moved it. Neither of them said anything about it being there, and neither said anything about it not being filled. After dinner, Mark did the dishes. Debbie dried. They talked about the neighbor's dog and the pothole on their street and whether the forecast was calling for snow. They were very good at this. Both of them. The practiced, necessary work of making the ordinary survive contact with the impossible. Mark flew home at 9. He lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word stable and the way Cecil had said his name when he landed too hard on the concrete. And he held his grief the way you hold something you don't fully understand yet, carefully, at a slight distance, waiting for its actual shape to become clear. He was 17 years old and he believed the people around him. There was no reason not to. The assignment came through on a Tuesday morning in the 7th month. Cecil delivered it himself. He sat across from Mark in the 3rd floor briefing room with a thin folder and a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, and explained it in the unhurried cadence of something genuinely minor. An anomalous energy reading in the sub-basement monitoring grid, cycling irregularly for the past 72 hours. Probably a feedback loop in the containment systems. Standard procedure to send a powered asset when the signature read above a certain threshold. Why not a maintenance team? Mark asked. The reading warrants caution. If there's an actual containment issue rather than a glitch, I want someone down there who can manage it. Mark nodded. He took the folder. The energy signature was charted across 3 pages. Irregular pulses, nothing dramatic. The kind of thing that looked exactly like what Cecil said it was. Sub-levels 1 through 5, Cecil said. You have full access. Check the junction panels on each level. Start at the bottom. Work up. Should take you an hour. Mark said he'd handle it. Cecil picked up his coffee and looked at it and set it back down. Good, he said. The sub-basement levels of Gita headquarters descended in a specific order that Mark had come to understand not as architecture but as geology, each level a record of something accumulated, stratified, pressed down under the weight of the levels above it. Sub-level 1 was administrative overflow, filing systems, decommissioned server banks, the kind of infrastructure that organizations generated and couldn't throw away and couldn't justify keeping visible. Sub-level 2 was communications, relay equipment, encrypted transmission hardware, the physical backbone of a network that moved information in ways that didn't appear on any public grid. Sub-level 3 Mark knew well. Weapons testing. He had spent time down here with Cecil's development teams evaluating containment rounds against his own durability. The walls still had scorch patterns from an experiment with plasma-based deterrents that had destroyed a significant portion of the eastern wall. Sub-level 4. Storage, alien artifact containment, sealed units housing materials recovered from the Flaxen incursions, and from deep space recovery operations Mark wasn't fully briefed on. Sub-level 5. Mark had been here once. He didn't have a clear memory of what it contained because Cecil had moved him through it quickly, and he had filed it as something he'd returned to and hadn't. The junction panel on sub-level 5 was fine. He checked it, confirmed the cycling loop, identified it as a feedback issue in the power regulation system, and corrected it in under 3 minutes. He was preparing to work back up through the levels when he noticed the stairwell. It continued downward. A stairwell, standard Gita construction. The same gray composite walls and strip lighting as every other level, descending below sub-level 5. It was not hidden. It simply continued, and the schematic in the folder he had been given showed the sub-basement levels terminating at sub-level 5, which meant the stairwell below was not on any document he had ever been handed. He stood at the top of it for a moment. The air coming up from below was different. Not temperature. The facility maintained consistent climate control, a quality of stillness that felt maintained rather than natural. And underneath it, at a threshold below what any human sensory system would register, something his body noticed before his mind named it, a faint, sourceless discomfort, like pressure applied from no specific direction. He went down. Sub-level 6 was sealed with a biometric lock his JITA clearance didn't open. The panel displayed a classification indicator he had never been assigned. He put his hand against the lock housing and applied precise, even pressure until the housing separated from the wall without triggering the alarm sensor mounted 2 inches above it. The door opened. Sub-level 7 was not on any schematic he had ever seen. The corridor was narrow. A single strip of emergency lighting ran along the ceiling, casting everything in pale, functional red. 3 doors, evenly spaced, each sealed independently. The walls had a different texture, not composite paneling but a poured material, dense, the construction of something meant to contain rather than house. The discomfort was stronger here, not pain, not nausea. Something that sat between those two things, a low, persistent wrongness that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He stood still and identified it as best he could, radiation. Not ionizing radiation in the conventional sense, nothing that would harm human tissue. Something calibrated differently. Something his Viltrumite biology was responding to the way an ear responds to a frequency at the very edge of audible range. He moved to the second door. It had a monitoring panel mounted beside it. The readout showed a single data stream, a cardiac waveform, steady and slow, cycling at approximately 32 beats per minute. Something in that room had a heartbeat. He opened the door. The smell arrived before anything else, the specific, accumulated residue of months of the same radiation he had been feeling in the corridor, concentrated and pressed into the walls and floor and recycled air until the room itself had absorbed it. His body's response intensified, that sourceless discomfort becoming something with more weight. The room was roughly 12 feet by 12. The walls were a dense alloy, dark with a faint metallic quality under the emergency lighting. Embedded in every surface at precise intervals were small cylindrical nodes, each one active. He could see the faint distortion of air around them, the emission of whatever they were producing, filling the room in overlapping fields. In the center of the room was a restraint frame, mounted to the floor with bolts sunk deep into the alloy foundation. Not a medical device, a structure built to hold something that could not otherwise be held. Heavy gauge restraint bands at the wrists, ankles, and a broad band across the chest, each connected by reinforced cable to the node grid in the walls. The person in the frame was Nolan Grayson. Mark did not move. He stood in the doorway and the information arrived in pieces, each one requiring its own moment to become real. His father was thinner. Viltrumite physiology didn't waste muscle the way human physiology did, but 7 months of irradiated suspension had done different kinds of damage. The result was a man who was identifiably Nolan Grayson and wrong in every measurement Mark had memorized without knowing he was memorizing it. His skin had a gray undertone. His hands, below the wrist restraints, were slightly tremored in their stillness. His chest rose and fell in slow, irregular cycles. His eyes were closed. Mark looked at the restraint bands, the nodes in the walls, the IV line running from a port in the wall to a catheter in his father's forearm, maintenance fluids, the minimum required to keep a body functional over an extended period. Someone had been maintaining him, regularly, for 7 months. The realization did not arrive as a single thing. It arrived the way the cold arrives when you've been outside long enough. An accumulation, each second adding to the last until the temperature of everything had changed. He took 3 steps forward and put his hand on his father's chest, just above the restraint band. He could feel the heartbeat. Slow, present. Nolan's eyes opened. The focusing took effort. The deliberate muscular work of eyes that had been closed for a long time finding the distance and the light and the object in front of them. They moved across the ceiling, then the doorway, then down. They found Mark's face. Nolan said one word. Mark. Not a question. Not a plea. Just the name. Said the way you say the name of something that has arrived without warning in a place where nothing was supposed to arrive, with the unguarded quality of genuine surprise. Mark took 3 steps back. He sat down on the floor of the cell, against the wall opposite the frame. The monitoring equipment registered his father's heart rate increasing for the first time in weeks. The nodes in the walls continued their emission without adjustment. The strip lighting in the corridor outside threw a thin bar of red across the floor between them. He sat there. The cardiac monitor kept its rhythm. Neither of them spoke. Mark didn't ask anything for a long time. He sat with his knees up and looked at his father and thought about the 7 months of training sessions and mission briefings and dinners at his mother's table, and the coffee mug that nobody moved, and the careful, precise warmth of Cecil Stedman saying his name at the entrance of a building that had a sublevel that wasn't on any schematic he had ever been given. He thought about what he knew about interrogation. Not from a manual, from Immortal, who had told him once that the worst thing you could do when you needed true information was imply the shape of the answer you expected. A subject who understood the frame you were working in would build their response to fit it. You wanted the frame to be empty. He reached through the door and took the water container from the maintenance shelf. He passed it through the cell port without standing up. Nolan worked his right hand against the wrist restraint until he had enough movement to reach it, and the effort that took, the visible, grinding work of joints immobilized for months, was information Mark filed without reacting to. Nolan drank. Slowly, his hands were tremoring. When he finished, Mark said, "When did you wake up?" Nolan's voice had the texture of something that hadn't been used in a long time. 3 weeks ago. Were you going to tell anyone? A pause long enough to have its own weight. I couldn't reach the communication panel from the frame. That's not what I asked. Nolan looked at him. He did not look away. No, he said, it isn't. Mark said, "What were you doing the night the Guardians were hurt?" The word hurt landed in the room and Nolan didn't correct it. He said, "I attacked them." Why? Nolan told him. He did not do it quickly, and he did not do it with apology, and he did not frame it as a confession. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed for 3 weeks and discovered, in the rehearsal. Costs him every single time, regardless of how many times he practices it. He was Viltrumite. Not human-born, not hybrid, not what he had spent 23 years allowing people to understand him as. He had been deployed to Earth as an agent of pacification. His function was integration, which meant weakening, which meant positioning Earth to be absorbed by an empire that had been expanding across the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. The Guardians were Earth's primary defense asset. Eliminating them was not violence for its own sake. It was procedure. Mark listened to all of it without moving. Then he said, "What empire?" Nolan told him about the Viltrumite Empire. He said it stripped of everything that might once have accompanied it. No pride, no recruitment, no underlying sales pitch. The Empire spanned thousands of planets. It had been expanding for millennia through a method that was consistent and effective, and had produced a civilization of near indestructible warriors from a species that had nearly destroyed itself and decided, in the aftermath, that weakness was the thing that had almost killed them, and acted accordingly. Earth was always a target. Had been designated as such before Mark was born. Nolan's 23 years here were the first phase of a process that had a second phase and a third phase, and an endpoint that looked nothing like what Earth currently was. Mark was half Viltrumite. Which meant, Nolan said, and here his voice changed, Mark would live for thousands of years. The people he trained with and ate dinner with would be gone within a human lifetime. This was not a metaphor. It was a timeline. Mark looked at him. Did you kill them? The ones who died. 2, Nolan said. Darkwing, Aquarius, he said their names without inflection. Not because he was performing callousness, Mark could read the difference, but because he had spent 3 weeks alone with the memory, and it had compressed into something that no longer carried the pitch of active emotion. Red Rush didn't die, Mark said. No, War Woman. No, Mark, let that sit. So they beat you. A pause. Yes, good, Mark said. Nolan didn't respond to that. Mark said, was I part of it? Was there a plan that included coming home after? The longest pause yet. I don't know. That's not. I know it isn't an answer. I'm telling you the truth of it. I know what my mission parameters were. I know that 23 years changes the calculation in ways I couldn't have predicted before I had them. Whether that means I would have come home or filed my report and requested extraction. He stopped. I don't know. I have spent 3 weeks in this room trying to find the honest answer to that question, and I don't have one. Mark looked at the floor between them, then at his father. Cecil, he made the correct call, Nolan said. From his position, with his information, he made the only call that kept Earth functional while he told me you were hurt, saving everyone. Mark's voice was steady, completely steady, which was the thing that cost him the most right now. He sat across from me and held my hand and told me, you put yourself between your team and the thing that wanted to hurt them. He let me train with the people who put you in this cell. For 7 months he let me. He built everything around a version of you that... He stopped. Regrouped, he used me, Mark said. Yes, Nolan said. He did. The way I used this planet. He told himself it was for a larger good. He may even be right. The cover story kept Earth from a panic response that would have made it significantly more vulnerable during a period when it had no primary defense infrastructure. The training you received is real. Your capability is real. None of that is false. That doesn't make it clean. No, it doesn't. The nodes in the walls continued their emission. The cardiac monitor kept its rhythm. Mark thought about the word clean and how it applied to exactly nothing in this room. Do you love us? He said. Mom, me, was any of it. He didn't finish the sentence because he couldn't find the ending that was specific enough to be worth asking. Nolan was quiet for a long time. I don't know what that word means to my species, he said finally. We don't have a word that maps to it. What we have are priorities, the things that, when threatened, produce a response that overrides the calculation. The things that your body decides matter before your mind can vote on it. He looked at his hands. I know that in 7 months alone in this room, the things I thought about were your mother making coffee on Sunday mornings, you learning to throw a baseball and overthinking the mechanics of it, the way she laughs when something catches her off guard. Small things, ordinary things, specific things. That's not an answer. No. But it's the truth. Which I understand is not the same thing. Mark sat with that. Then, is the Empire going to send someone? They're already overdue. How long? Months could already be in observation range. Mark nodded. He stood up. He looked at his father in the frame, at the restraint bands, at the gray tinge in his skin, at the hands still slightly tremored in their stillness. Are you going to tell Cecil you're awake? He said. That's your choice, Nolan said. Not mine. It was the first time in the conversation that Nolan had deferred anything to Mark. Not submission, recognition, the specific acknowledgement of someone who understood they were no longer in a position to manage anything. Mark didn't answer. He walked out of the cell, back through the corridor, and up the stairs, and through the levels of the building, and crossed the main floor of JETA headquarters with a face that Cecil's security cameras would later describe in his review log as completely neutral, no threat indicators detected. He walked past 3 agents who said good morning. He said good morning back. He went outside and went straight up until the city was a diagram below him, and the cold at altitude was the specific, clean cold of a place where nothing was managed or maintained. He stayed up there for a long time. Mark scheduled the meeting. That was the detail Cecil noted first. Not a drop-in, not a comm request, not the unannounced energy of a 17-year-old who couldn't wait. A scheduled meeting. Formal request through the administrative channel, submitted at 11:47 p.m. Cecil had studied Mark's vault access footage 4 hours after the breach. He had watched him fix the junction panel on sublevel 5, stand at the top of the sublevel 7 stairwell for 19 seconds, remove the biometric housing with the careful, deliberate pressure of someone who had thought about exactly how much force was required. He had watched him descend. He had not deployed a response team. He had sat with the monitor feed and waited, because the only thing worse than Mark finding the vault was Mark finding it, and Cecil overplaying his hand in the aftermath. Mark came through the door and sat down and did not look at the folder Cecil had opened on the table. "I know," he said. Cecil closed the folder. "How much?" "Everything that matters." Cecil nodded slowly. He did not reach for a cigar. "All right." "Don't," Mark said. "Don't what?" "Don't start explaining. I know the explanation. I've been running it since last night, and I understand every part of it. The panic scenario, the intelligence value, the Guardians needing a functional mission, me needing a reason to train that wasn't the actual reason. I understand why you did it. That's not what this meeting is. What is this meeting? I'm telling you that I know, that the architecture you built around me for 7 months is gone, and I know what's underneath it." Cecil said, "The Empire is coming. I know that too. Then you understand that this is not the moment for. I understand that you've been hoping," Mark said, "not preparing. Hoping he never wakes up, or that I never go below sublevel 5. He leaned forward. "When did you know?" "That night, or before." "That night. Did you know before that he wasn't what he said he was?" A beat that lasted exactly long enough to be its own answer. "I had indicators. Nothing that crossed the threshold to actionable. But you had indicators." "Yes." Mark stood up. "I'm done," he said. Cecil sent 2 agents after him. He didn't expect it to work. He deployed them anyway because 30 years of this job had calcified certain responses into something below conscious decision-making. He knew Mark would find the tag. He was mildly curious how long it would take. 14 minutes. Mark pulled it from the hem of his suit while sitting on a bench in Grant Park, held it up briefly toward the nearest likely surveillance position, and set it on the bench beside him. Then, he sat for another 10 minutes looking at the lake before he left. Cecil watched the tag sitting on the park bench camera feed. He lit a cigar. He thought about the 14 minutes and decided it was reasonable given that Mark had never been trained to sweep for tracking devices. He updated several calculations. Mark flew to his mother's house and sat in the living room while Debbie made tea he didn't ask for. She brought it anyway and sat across from him and looked at his face with the specific literacy of a woman who had spent 17 years reading her husband's silences and transferred that skill, without entirely meaning to her son. She didn't ask what happened. He sat with the question of whether to tell her. He turned it over and examined it from the angles available, what she would do with the information, what it would cost her, what it would cost him, whether the cost to her was his to calculate, or whether that calculation was itself the same logic Cecil had used and he had just spent 20 minutes rejecting. He decided against it, not to protect Cecil. Not because the lie deserved to survive, because the Empire was somewhere in low Earth orbit, running an observation arc, and he needed his mother to move through her days without the specific paralysis the truth would produce, and he needed that for tactical reasons, and he hated himself quietly and precisely for thinking in tactical reasons when he was sitting in his mother's living room. He stayed for dinner. He was the best version of himself for 2 hours. He told her about a training session where Red Rush had attempted to demonstrate a speed reading technique and miscalculated a turn radius and put himself through a chain-link fence. Debbie laughed. A real laugh, the kind that surprised her slightly. Mark laughed too. The laugh was also real, which was the thing about grief. It didn't make other things false. It just made them heavier. He did the dishes before he left. He hugged her at the door for slightly longer than usual, and she didn't comment on it, and he was grateful. He flew home and did not sleep. Over the weeks that followed, the shape of Mark's operations changed. He worked without GIDA authorization. Not in opposition to the GIDA, The threats that appeared on his monitoring systems were real threats requiring response regardless of administrative context. He responded to them with increasing efficiency and decreasing gentleness, which was not a conscious choice but a pattern he noticed when he reviewed his memory of engagements. He was precise. He was not careful in the way War Woman had taught him careful. The 10%, 5%, 1% gradation of force, designed to operate safely in proximity to people who couldn't survive his mistakes. The care was directional now. It pointed at the people he was protecting rather than the things he was stopping. He built monitoring equipment. He had Nolan's descriptions of how a Viltrumite moved in approach, the atmospheric displacement of high-velocity descent, the orbital signature of a mass that large and low observation arc, and he sourced components and positioned units at 5 points around the globe. The system was imprecise, and he knew it and checked it daily anyway, because imprecise was better than blind. He avoided the surviving Guardians when possible. There were incidents where their operational territories overlapped, and he worked those problems with the functional efficiency of someone who respected the people beside him and had nothing personal to say to them. At a flooding event in Sao Paulo, he and War Woman worked for 4 hours clearing infrastructure and evacuating a residential district, and did not speak except to coordinate. When they finished, she watched him go with an expression he didn't look back to read. He maintained a surveillance tap on Sublevel 7, a passive relay dormant enough to avoid detection, active enough to feed him the cardiac readout and the cell's audio environment. He checked it once a week. His father was awake more consistently now. Once, on a Wednesday evening, Mark watched him attempt to exercise, working his arms against the restraint bands in slow, deliberate repetitions, maintaining the muscle memory of a body that intended to be used again. Mark did not know what to do with this. He noted it. He moved on. The alert came at 3:14 am on a Tuesday. A soft pulse on the monitor relay on his bedroom desk. A single indicator light shifting from green to amber. He was awake already. He leaned over and read the data. The displacement signature Nolan had described was present in low Earth orbit. The positioning data showed it moving in a slow elliptical arc, not a transit path, not a descent trajectory. An observation arc. The kind of movement that meant something was up there looking down and had been doing so long enough to develop a picture. The timestamp on the first recorded hit was 48 hours ago. He sat back. Whatever was in that orbit had been watching Earth for 2 days before his equipment caught it. It had already seen what it came to see. He thought about Nolan saying months, maybe already in observation range, and the way he had said it without urgency, because urgency was a human response to timelines. Mark had, he estimated, 3 days before the observation arc resolved into a descent. He did not call Cecil. He did not call the Guardians. He turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark, and began, quietly and alone, to plan. Anissa had been in orbit for 51 hours when she decided she had seen enough. She floated in the upper thermosphere with the patient stillness of someone who understood that observation was not preliminary to the work, it was the first phase of it. Below her, the planet turned. City grids resolved into legible patterns, the density of infrastructure indicating population concentration, the dark patches between them indicating resource distribution. She had pacified other worlds, planets with more advanced technology, species with greater physical capability, defense structures more sophisticated than what she had mapped in 51 hours. She had also faced species more psychologically unified in resistance. Earth was none of those things. What it was disorganized in a specific way she was still categorizing. Its primary institutional defense structure, the JITA, identified through intercepted communications within the first 6 hours, functioned as both a coordination body and a concealment body simultaneously. Most civilizations had one or the other. Earth was attempting both, which suggested a governing intelligence that was reactive rather than strategic. She had identified the Guardians within 12 hours. One anomaly in her mapping, a hybrid electromagnetic signature at multiple locations across the planet's surface, mobile, inconsistent in routing, not associated with any fixed GIDA coordinate. Half Viltrumite. She had run the assessment 3 times because the result was unexpected. A half-Viltrumite operating independently, without Imperial sanction. That was Nolan's variable. That was what the missed reports hadn't explained. The Guardians were not a meaningful threat individually or in combination. The one with regeneration was the only asset requiring sustained attention. Not because he could damage her, but because assets that couldn't be permanently removed consumed time. She had designated the Guardians as her first demonstration target within 20 hours of arrival. Demonstration, not elimination. A demonstration established control parameters for the general population, it showed, concretely and visibly, the gap between Earth's most capable defenders and what she represented. Populations that witnessed this gap early tended to resolve their resistance calculus faster. She descended on the morning of the 3rd day. She came in over the Atlantic at an angle that kept her below commercial flight paths and above maritime radar coverage. A band of airspace Earth's monitoring infrastructure left largely unobserved. She made landfall over the Virginia coast at an altitude of 40 feet, crossing to Washington, D.C. Before any ground-based monitoring system had completed a sensor cycle, she landed in a park 3 blocks from Guardian headquarters and civilian clothing. A practical adaptation she'd developed after determining that arriving in combat configuration reduced her observation window because targets mobilized immediately. She walked. The city moved around her with the texture of a population that had no idea what had just arrived in it. Guardian headquarters was a 12-story building with a facade considerably more reinforced than it appeared from street level. The entry protocols she had mapped from orbit. The security camera positions. The electromagnetic emissions from the monitoring equipment in the upper floors. She did not go in through the entrance. She identified the 14th floor, conference room, 2 heat signatures consistent with large physical mass, and went up the exterior in 2 seconds and came through the window. The Immortal was on his feet before she landed. War Woman was already standing, her weapon in her hand, threat response time under 1 second from a seated position. "I am looking for a Viltrumite male," Anissa said, "stationed on this planet approximately 23 years ago. His name is Nolan. He has missed 3 reporting cycles. Where is he?" She phrased it without interrogative inflection. It was not a question in any register that mattered. War Woman said, "Who are you?" "I'm here for a missing colleague. If he's dead, I need to confirm that. If he's alive, I need to speak with him. If you can facilitate either outcome, I would prefer not to damage this building further." Immortal looked at her steadily. Something was moving behind his expression, and if we don't know where he is, then we proceed differently. The alarm activated, a remote trigger on his person. The building changed around them. The remaining Guardians would arrive within 90 seconds. She looked between them, giving them a final window in which cooperation was still a variable. War Woman's grip on her weapon adjusted, repositioning for a different strike angle. Anissa recognized it as the work of someone who had studied where to hit things considerably harder than her. "Last time," Anissa said. "Nolan Grayson." "Where? Get out of our building," War Woman said. Anissa looked at her for 1 moment. Then she said, "All right." Red Rush came through the door first, already in his second stride, and Anissa tracked his entry vector in the half-second before he was on her. He hit her in the jaw. The impact was genuine, meaningful force, his velocity concentrated into a single point. Her head rotated with it. The rotation took 1 second to correct. She watched his movement pattern for 3 circuits, then placed herself at the intersection of his arc and the far wall on his 4th approach. She didn't try to match his speed. She put herself where he was going to be. Her hand closed around his ankle in the middle of his stride. The deceleration was instantaneous. His momentum became a liability at the exact moment it was redirected. She drove him into the floor with the full force of his own velocity applied downward. Rush hit the floor, and the floor lost the argument. She looked at the crater his impact had made. Conscious, moving, his right leg bent at an angle, confirming multiple fractures, but vital signs functional. Neutralized, the engagement had produced a clear demonstration of the force differential. and expending further resource on a non-threat was inefficient. Green Ghost came through the wall. Green Ghost's first strike passed through Anissa's shoulder, phasing in, solidifying briefly inside the joint, phasing out. The result was a burst of pressure inside the shoulder capsule that Anissa had no prior reference for. Not pain exactly, a wrongness. She processed the mechanic. Phase to move, solidify to strike, phase out to withdraw. The solidification window was the variable. She let the second and third strikes connect while she timed it. 0.4 seconds from phase in to phase out. Green Ghost phased in for the fourth strike, targeting the base of Anissa's skull from directly behind. Anissa's fist was already at the position where her face was going to be. The impact was total. Green Ghost's momentum carried her face directly into Anissa's knuckles at the moment she solidified, with no defensive positioning, no bracing. She went through the wall behind her. Then the window. Then she was in the street 14 floors below, leaving a human-shaped impression in the concrete. Warwoman did not come at Anissa directly. She moved along the perimeter and targeted Anissa's wrist as her arm extended, catching it in both hands, her weapon braced for leverage, driving its butt into Anissa's elbow joint at an anatomically precise angle. The hyperextension was genuine. Anissa's arm bent in the wrong direction for a full second. Anissa looked at her arm. Then, at Warwoman. That was the correct instinct, she said. Warwoman was already repositioning. She swung from a lower angle, aiming for the knee, the same pressure point logic. Anissa caught the weapon, held it at the midpoint, and applied lateral force that wrenched it from her grip without breaking her hands, because excess was inefficient. Then she hit Warwoman. A single strike, full extension, concentrated into the center of her chest at a downward angle. Warwoman hit the wall, then the floor, and came to rest against the baseboard in the configuration of someone whose frame had absorbed more than it was built to absorb. She was breathing, shallow, rapid, the breathing of a collapsed lung. She was not going to get up. The Immortal had been waiting. He came at her when Warwoman hit the floor. No weapon, no classifiable technique. The simple and total commitment of someone who had been doing this longer than any living system she had encountered, and reduced it to irreducible components. He hit her in the face. The throat. He got both arms around her from behind in a grapple that was not about strength, but about time. About cost. She broke the grapple. She took his head in both hands and rotated it past the threshold his spine was designed for. He dropped. 40 seconds later he was breathing again. She watched his body reconstruct the catastrophic cervical damage, a progressive return of motor function moving outward from the spinal column. He rose. She drove her fist through his chest. He went down for 6 minutes. He rose again, chest still reconstructing. She took him apart at the shoulder joint. He went to one knee. He rose again. She looked at him standing there with his chest still reforming, and his arm reattaching, and his face carrying the expression of someone who had died 3 times in 4 minutes, and found it less persuasive each time as an argument for stopping. She took his head between both hands and began to apply compression. She increased the force gradually, monitoring his response. "You'll have to do this forever," Immortal said. The words came out compressed and damaged, and entirely clear. "I have time," Anissa said. She increased the pressure until he crossed below the threshold of functional consciousness. Then she heard something outside, a velocity displacement, a familiar weight, the acoustic signature of someone descending fast from altitude. She released Immortal. He dropped. His biology resumed its work. She turned toward the building's destroyed exterior. Mark landed in the wreckage of the main floor. He came down through the hole she had made and stood in the debris and looked at the room with a face that processed what it found without broadcasting the processing. Rush against the wall, his leg at the wrong angle. Warwoman against the baseboard, breathing in shallow cycles. Immortal on the floor, his chest rebuilding. Mark looked at all of it. Then he looked at her. She tilted her head slightly. the involuntary physical response to encountering something her data hadn't fully prepared her for. "You're half Viltrumite," she said. "That's unusual." "Did you kill them?" Mark said. "None of them are dead." "I was establishing parameters." "What parameters?" "That resistance is expensive." She looked at him with the same flat, measuring attention she had given everything else in this room. "I'm looking for Nolan Grayson. You know what I am, so you understand what I can do. Where is he?" Mark looked at her for a moment. His face did not change. Then he went straight up through the ceiling without answering. She watched the hole he left in the roof. She was not concerned. He was not running. She could tell the difference. She went out through the window and began working through her secondary objective list, because whatever Mark Grayson was doing, he would need time to do it. Mark dismantled the first containment door in 4 minutes, not cleanly, finding the structural weak point at the frame junction and applying even, sustained pressure until the frame separated from the wall and the door came with it. He disabled the acoustic sensors, the secondary camera relay. Then the 2 agents who came around the corner, he took the first one down with a controlled strike to the pressure point at the junction of neck and shoulder, caught him before he hit the floor, and used his falling weight to create a blind spot for the second agent's sightline. The second agent went down beside the first. Significant headaches. No significant injuries. Cecil's voice came through his frequency. Mark had left it active. "She's already there, isn't she?" Cecil said. "She's been and gone. She'll be back when she figures out I'm not going to tell her anything." "Mark, whatever you're thinking, there is a Viltrumite at full combat capability working through every defense asset on this planet. Your guardians are in surgery. I am not going to stop her alone. You know that. You have been running calculations on this scenario since you put him in that cell." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm that Cecile had in fact been running those calculations. "What you're suggesting has catastrophic variables. So does the alternative." He descended to sub-level 7. Nolan was awake. He looked at Mark in the doorway without surprise. He had heard the containment door come off the frame 3 levels up. Mark came into the cell and said, "A Viltrumite operative arrived yesterday. She went through all 4 surviving guardians in under 10 minutes. She's looking for you. She'll find you here regardless of what Cecil does with the security protocols." "If they sent someone at that level," Nolan said, "they've finished their assessment phase. They're past observation. I can't beat her alone." Nolan looked at him. "I know, but you can." The sentence sat in the cell. The nodes in the walls were dark. Mark had cut the power to the emitter grid from the junction panel on his way down. The restraint bands were still in place, but mechanical now. The room without the emitters had a different quality, not warmer, but less wrong. "Mark, I'm not asking for anything except a yes or a no. I'm telling you the tactical situation and giving you a choice. Help me end this threat, or stay in this cell and wait for her to locate you. At which point she executes you for mission failure and removes the only Viltrumite-capable asset from this equation. And if we stop her, what happens after? You leave. You walk away from Earth and go wherever you go, and I never want to see you again. But my mother is still alive when you leave. This planet is still here when you leave." Nolan was quiet. His eyes moved across Mark's face with the attention of someone reading something they have been waiting to read for a long time. "If I leave Earth after this, the Empire recategorizes the mission," he said. "Failed pacifications get reviewed, resource costed, reprioritized. With the Coalition war-drawing resources, they write Earth as a low-yield target and wait for a better window. That could be a decade. Could be longer. I'll take a decade. It's not a permanent solution. I know what it is. Say yes or say no." Nolan looked at his hands in the restraint bands. The tremoring had decreased over the past weeks, the cellular recovery progressing. "If I agree," he said, "the fight will produce significant collateral damage. I am not at full capacity and she is. We will be covering ground that has people on it. I've mapped 3 sites in rural Virginia within her current operational pattern and outside civilian population density. I've been tracking her movement for 18 hours. Nolan was quiet for a moment. You planned this before you came down here. I planned for the possibility. That's not the same thing. No, Mark said. It isn't. Something moved across Nolan's face that didn't resolve into any expression Mark had a name for. Then he said, yes. Mark removed the restraint bands in the order he had worked out from 3 months of studying their construction on the surveillance feed. Chest band first, then the wrists, then the ankles. Nolan sat forward in the frame and breathed, with the deliberate fullness of someone relearning the mechanics of a body administered at 50% for 7 months. Cecil's voice came through the facility comm. Mark, if Nolan leaves this facility, I cannot protect the operational integrity of... I know, Cecil, that's why I'm doing it and not you. Nolan put his feet on the floor. He stood, unsteady for 2 seconds. The unsteadiness of a body recalibrating to full gravity and full autonomy simultaneously, and then he was not unsteady. He worked through the inventory of himself with the practiced economy of a being who had been doing pre-engagement self-assessment for centuries. Something returned to his face that had not been there in any surveillance footage Mark had reviewed over the past months. Not warmth, not relief. A quality of presence, the specific, grounded awareness of someone who has remembered what they are after a period of being prevented from being it. Mark looked at him standing there in the dark cell and felt something he didn't have language for and didn't try to name. Don't make me regret this, he said. You already regret it, Nolan said. That's the correct response. He moved toward the door. Mark stepped aside. They went up through the levels without speaking. The agents Mark had taken down were still unconscious. Nolan looked at them as he stepped past, not at their faces, at their positioning, the way they had been set down. He looked at Mark. Mark said nothing. They crossed the main floor. 3 remaining agents saw Nolan and processed what they were seeing slowly. Cecil had not issued a lethal response order, which told Mark that Cecil had run the calculation and arrived at the same place Mark had. That there was no version of a lethal response order that improved the outcome from here. Outside, morning air. Nolan stopped just outside the door. He looked up, not at the sky exactly, at the space above the sky, at the distance beyond what was visible. Whatever he was looking at, it wasn't Earth. Mark stood beside him. Can you fight? Not at full capacity. Can you fight? Yes, then that's enough. Let's go. They went up together, and the city fell away below them, and Mark pulled up the tracking data on Anissa's last recorded position and set his course. And Nolan flew beside him without asking where they were going, because he understood that the person with the current operational intelligence led and the person without it followed. It was the first time in Mark's life that his father had followed him anywhere. He didn't think about what that meant. He had a fight to get to. Mark's tracking data put Anissa in rural Virginia at 6:47 a.m., working through a JETA communications relay 40 miles outside the city. She was destroying it because it was on her list, and she was working her list in order. Mark and Nolan came in from the east, out of the sunrise. The light at that angle degraded visual acquisition from the ground. They came in low over the tree line and landed 30 meters from where Anissa stood in the wreckage of the relay tower's base structure, a section of steel lattice still in her hand that she set down with the unhurried practicality of someone putting down a tool they had finished using. She looked at them. She looked at Mark first, then at Nolan, and the assessment took longer than her assessments usually took. Nolan, she said. Anissa, she studied him, his pallor, the radiation residue still visible in his skin. You've been in containment, she said. They held you. Yes, and now you're standing with one of them. Yes, she looked at Nolan for a long moment with the expression of someone encountering a variable their framework has no category for, and deciding that the absence of a category doesn't change the operational requirement. The Empire will not send me twice, she said. You understand what this means. I know what it means. Then you know this doesn't end with you leaving. Yes, I know that too. She stopped trying to understand it. She shifted her weight forward, and her posture changed in the specific way of someone who has finished the part of an engagement that involves language. Mark's plan lasted 40 seconds. It was a good plan, built on 7 months of Guardian training and 2 months of independent tactical analysis, and everything Nolan had told him about how Viltrumite combat warriors assessed and responded to coordinated engagement. The core logic was sound. Nolan absorbed her direct force. Mark worked angles and disruption. They cycled her continuously. Anissa broke the cycle by targeting Mark first. She had assessed that Mark was the strategic architecture of the pairing, and Nolan was running on a diminished baseline. Removing the architecture destabilized the system. She came off a grapple with Nolan and crossed the distance to Mark in a straight line and hit him in the torso with full extension. The force drove him backward through a tree line and into the hillside beyond it. The hillside lost a significant portion of its eastern face. Nolan caught her from behind, both arms around her in a full rear grapple. His strength diminished, but still meaningful. She couldn't break it in the first second, which told her it would cost her something to break it. She went backward at full acceleration into the tree line. The impact against the trunks broke his grip. She pulled free, turned, hit him in the face with a strike that opened his cheekbone along its full lateral length. Viltrumite physiology was supposed to begin closing that wound within seconds. It didn't. The radiation had done what Cecil designed it to do. The cheekbones stayed open. She filed this. Mark came back from the hillside carrying part of it, a section of rock face roughly the dimensions of a shipping container, moving at a speed that didn't allow for anything except the decision she had to make about whether to be underneath it when it arrived. She was underneath it when it arrived. The impact drove her 2 meters into the earth. She came up with genuine abrasion across her neck and a ringing in her skull she hadn't experienced in a long time. She was breathing harder. She looked between the two of them and updated several figures she had estimated from orbit. The fight spread across 2 miles of Virginia countryside. It moved because neither side could hold a position long enough for position to matter. Every exchange ended in a displacement that created the next exchange 50 meters from the last one, and the ground between their starting point and where they were now was a record of what had happened, written in craters and redirected water and stands of trees that no longer stood. Anissa broke Mark's left arm in the 7th minute. A controlled strike to the point of maximum structural fragility while he had both hands occupied redirecting her momentum. Clean break, both bones, mid-shaft. He reset. He continued. She drove him into the earth 3 times in the following 4 minutes. Each time he came out faster than he had gone in, because whatever was happening to him in this fight had passed the threshold of trained response and entered a territory that training had been preparing him for without being able to produce it directly. He was hitting with more of himself behind each strike, less overhead, less calculation. The Viltrumite inheritance, running at a register it had never fully accessed in 17 years. Nolan was losing the accumulation. Every strike Anissa landed stayed. His cheekbone, still open. His left hand, 2 fingers bent at angles they didn't return from. His breathing had changed. She had landed strikes to his ribcage that his recovery rate wasn't keeping pace with. A man fighting on a narrowing operational baseline that he could feel narrowing in real time and was choosing not to acknowledge. He kept fighting. Anissa made her decision in the 9th minute. She could not produce a decisive outcome against both of them simultaneously at their current aggregate capability. She needed to reduce the equation. She identified Nolan as the correct target, not because he was the greater immediate threat, but because Mark's combat output correlated visibly to Nolan's continued presence. When Nolan held a position, Mark's strike frequency and accuracy increased. When Nolan was displaced, Mark showed fractional degradation before recovering. Remove Nolan. Degrade Mark. Close the engagement. She broke away from Mark's exchange with a lateral feint and crossed the distance to Nolan in a straight line. Just velocity and mass and full commitment applied directly. Nolan saw it. She knew because she could see him see it, the recognition in his face. A combat experienced being reading an incoming vector and completing the calculation of what it meant. He looked to his left. Mark was there, 12 meters away, mid-recovery from the feint, directly in the path her momentum would carry her if something interrupted it. Nolan looked back at her. He did not move. Her fist connected with his sternum, at full extension, full velocity. The impact compressed his chest inward. Not a surface impact, a structural one. She followed through, and she felt the internal architecture give way. Nolan hit the ground. He did not get back up. She turned to Mark. Mark was already moving toward his father. She intercepted him. She placed herself between them and hit him, a positioning strike, driving him away from Nolan's location. He came back immediately. She hit him again. He came back a third time, and she let him come, because the third approach carried a different quality. He hit her in the jaw, the hardest single strike she had taken in this engagement. Her head rotated fully, the world going sideways for 1 second before her vestibular system corrected. She looked at him. His left arm was broken. His face had a laceration, bleeding in the slow, reluctant way of Viltrumite biology trying to recover under combat stress. He was standing with his father on the ground behind her, and his broken arm held at his side, and his right fist still raised. His face was completely still. She hit him. He got up. She hit him again. He got up again. She drove him into the earth for the 4th time, and followed him down and hit him twice more at close range, and the ground cracked outward in a spiderweb pattern extending 6 meters in every direction. He got up a 4th time. She ran the assessment, and it returned something she had not received from any prior engagement. She did not have a clean path to a decisive outcome. She loaded her next strike with everything she had, and threw it at his head, and he was not where his head had been. He caught her arm. Full extension, mid-strike, both his hands closing around her forearm at the point of maximum overextension. He locked her position and drove his knee into her elbow joint from below at an angle that was anatomically precise in a way no untrained fighter produced. Her arm broke. She did not cry out. She looked at her arm. She looked at him. He did not give her the second she needed. The crater was 6 feet deep and roughly circular, and the morning light was just beginning to reach its bottom. Mark stood at its edge for a moment. Then he climbed down into it. He did what needed to be done with the same stillness he had carried through the last 4 minutes. Not rage, not triumph, just the clear, forward-moving logic of someone completing a necessary task with full knowledge of what it cost, and no available alternative that cost less. Anissa died in the crater as the sun cleared the tree line. Mark stood over her and did not feel what he expected to feel, which was relief. What he felt was the specific, permanent weight of a threshold crossed, the understanding that he had become something in the last 4 minutes that he had not been before them, and that the becoming was irreversible, and that irreversible was simply the word for things that mattered enough to do. He climbed back out. He walked to where his father was. Nolan was conscious. Barely, the word applied in its most technical sense, meaning his eyes were open and tracking, and the processes behind them were still running. The chest damage had progressed through the fight's final phase, and the cellular recovery had not kept pace. He was breathing in a way that had a sound to it that Mark had no desire to identify more precisely. Mark sat down beside him, in the grass. The field around them was 2 miles of evidence: craters, redirected water, the broken geometry of a tree line. From where they were sitting it was just a field with morning light on it, and 2 people, and the particular quality of quiet that existed after something very loud. Nolan looked at him for a long time. "The same eyes," he said. Mark looked at him. "What? Your mother? You have the same eyes." Mark looked at his father's chest and at the field, and at the sky where Anissa was no longer in orbit. "You used to tell me you stayed because of us," he said. "When I was small you said that the mission had stopped being the only thing. I don't know if it was true then. I don't know if you knew. It was becoming true," Nolan said, "whether I knew it or not. Both things were happening at the same time. And the mission. Both things were real." His voice had the flatness of someone spending remaining processing capacity on accuracy rather than comfort. I couldn't explain that to you. I don't know that I can now. But both things were real at the same time. That's the truth of it. Mark looked at him. I know, he said. Nolan's breathing shifted, a recalibration his body was making on its own because the voluntary systems were becoming less reliable. He looked at the sky. I'm not okay. You know I'm not okay. No, I meant, are you going to be okay? Eventually, Mark looked at the crater he had walked out of. At the field. At the sun continuing its indifferent progress across the morning sky. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'm going to be here, he said. That's not the same thing. Nolan looked at him. No, he said. But it's enough. His chest stopped cycling. There was no particular moment to point to. His body simply reached the end of what it had available and stopped, and the stillness that followed was the same stillness the field had around it. Continuous and without boundary. Mark sat beside him for a long time, long enough for the sun to move a meaningful distance, long enough for the birds in the remaining tree line to resume the noise they had suspended during the fight and forget, in the way that birds forgot, that anything had changed. Then, he stood up. Cecil arrived 40 minutes later in a helicopter that landed in the field's southern end. He came alone, no tactical team, no armed response. Just Cecil in his coat, walking across the damaged ground with the careful footing of someone navigating terrain recently restructured by forces outside normal engineering. He looked at Anissa's crater, stood at its edge for a moment with the expression of a man verifying a calculation he already knows the answer to. Then he walked to where Mark was standing beside Nolan. He looked at Nolan for a long time. He did not say anything during this. Whatever he was doing with those seconds was his own business, and Mark let him have it. She's dead, Cecil said. Yes, the Empire. We'll recategorize the mission as a failed pacification. Review it. Cost it against the Coalition war resource demand. Deprioritize. Mark looked at him. You have years. Probably more than a decade. Nolan was certain enough about the timeline that I'm treating it as reliable. Cecil nodded slowly. The Guardians, he said. Rush will recover. War Woman needs time. Green Ghost, I don't know yet. Immortal is immortal. Yes, Cecil reached into his jacket and produced nothing. The gesture was habitual, interrupted by something. He put his hand back in his pocket. And you? Mark looked at him. The question was genuine, and they both knew it was also the wrong question, and he asked it anyway because asking it was the only thing he had left to offer. I need you to bury him, Mark said. Not publicly. Not with a cover story or a classified designation or a file number. You put him in the ground, and you know who he was, and that's the end of it. Okay, and you stay out of my way. Cecil looked at him. Mark, I'm not threatening you. I understand what you do, and I understand why you do it, and I'm not going to spend whatever comes next fighting the Gita. You want to rebuild the Guardians? Rebuild them. You want intelligence on what the Empire will do next? I'll give it to you. You need someone to handle a threat that nothing else on this planet can handle. Call me. Mark held his gaze. But you don't run my operations. You don't manage my movements. You don't build anything around me again without my knowledge. And you never lie to me again. Cecil held his gaze for a long time. He had spent 30 years constructing the infrastructure of necessary deception and was being asked to dismantle one specific application of it by a 17-year-old who had just killed a Viltrumite operative in single combat and was not breathing hard. Understood, Cecil said. Mark looked at his father one last time. Then he went up without saying goodbye. He knocked on his mother's door instead of walking through it. Debbie opened it and looked at him, at the suit, at the damage written across it, at his face, and she did not ask what had happened, because she had spent 23 years learning not to ask certain questions at certain times. And she opened the door wider and stepped back. He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table. She made coffee. She did not rush it, and did not talk while she made it, and she set it in front of him, and sat across from him with her own cup, and looked at him with the specific patience of someone who understood there were things she was not going to be told tonight and had decided tonight that was acceptable. He would tell her about Nolan. Not now. Not in this kitchen at this hour with the coffee still hot and her face in the configuration of someone holding themselves together through the practice of ordinary tasks. He would find the words eventually. They would not be good words. There were no good words for what he was going to have to tell her, but they would be true, and true was what he owed her. "You're still here," Debbie said. "Yeah, that's enough for tonight." He drank the coffee. It was too hot, and he drank it anyway. Outside, the morning was advancing toward the kind of ordinary Tuesday that had no knowledge of what had occurred 40 miles away in a field in Virginia, and the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard, and the pothole on the street was still there, because it had been there since September, and nobody had come to fix it. 6 months later, the Guardians of the Globe were rebuilt under GDA authority. Mark Grayson declined a position on the roster. He did not explain why. Cecil did not push. Red Rush returned to active duty 11 weeks after the engagement. His right leg healed correctly. He ran a full circuit of the eastern seaboard on his first day back and told no one he had done it. Warwoman spent 7 months in rehabilitation. She returned without announcement, took her position in the new Guardians roster, and trained the new members in pressure point combat mechanics with a specificity that suggested she had spent her recovery time thinking about very little else. Green Ghost returned after 11 months. She did not discuss what had happened in the building. She did not discuss the maneuver she had improvised in the first ambush. She came back and she worked, and the work was what she had instead of the conversation. Immortal regenerated fully in 4 days. He attended Nolan Grayson's burial, the only person besides Mark who did. He stood at the grave without speaking for a long time. When he left, he did not look back. The grave had no marker. Mark had decided against one. The ground knew what was in it. That was sufficient. The Viltrum Empire did not send another operative for 11 years. When they came, Mark Grayson was 28 years old and had spent a decade preparing for them, and the fight that followed was its own story entirely. On a hillside above his mother's house, in the hour before dawn on a Wednesday that looked like every other Wednesday, Mark sat with his arms on his knees and looked at the horizon where the sky was beginning to change color at its edge. He was not posed. He was not surveying. He was sitting the way a person sits when they have finished something very long and have not yet determined what begins next. He thought about his father saying both things were real, and about his mother's coffee, and about the coffee mug that still sat at the third place at the kitchen table, because neither of them had moved it yet, and perhaps neither of them would. He thought about the crater, and about what he had done in it, and about the word irreversible, and about what it meant to carry something irreversible forward into a life that continued regardless. He stood. He was steady. He went up into the dark above the hillside, and the city spread out below him in its grid of light, and the planet turned under him, with its 8 billion people moving through their Wednesday without knowledge of what stood between them and the thing that wanted to claim them. He was not their champion. He was not their symbol. He had no roster, no authorization, no institutional context that made what he was into something with a clean name. He was the thing that stayed. He went to work. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.